So very good afternoon to everybody. At the outset, I'm extremely grateful to the GB Pant alumni for this invitation. It's an honor to be here on this stage. Thank you, sir. So I bring greetings from Gangaram Hospital, and I shall be discussing in the next 15 minutes about GI manometry, reading to application. This is the topic that has been allotted to me. So if we talk of GI manometry, basically manometry is an instrument which measures intraluminal pressures and helps us to know about the coordination of muscles. There are 4 types of manometry available: esophageal, anorectal, anteroduodenal, and colonic. But practically, we all use the esophageal and anorectal more commonly because the other 2 modalities are still, not very standardized. And if I talk about the nuances involved, I think the esophageal manometry has a lot of it. So I'll be discussing more and focusing more on that aspect. So nowadays, I have heard many, the youngsters telling me that the company itself promotes that you do a manometry, you don't have to understand much, just put the graph in Chat GPT and you have a diagnosis. This is the way the manometry is being, investigated in a few centers. But understand that that is not always true. There's a 50% error rate when we just try to do an automated analysis using a manometry. And at least this is one such field still where our human intellect will still outscore and beat the existing AI enabled diagnosis for a certain given graph. There are a lot of nuances to that. So if we look at manometry as a modality, so what it basically tells us is that if we were to see the line diagrams of what is happening in the esophagus, we would see a peristaltic wave, a high pressure wave, starting from the top and going to the bottom like this, right? But it is happening in body in 3 dimensions. And how do we see something that is happening in 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional screen? How do you represent that on a 2-dimensional screen? So it has been converted into something called as a Claus plot. Professor Ray Claus gave us this idea that basically we are trying to depict these changes in the pressure in form of different colors. So whenever you see a manometry graph, you will be seeing different varied colors. You will be seeing colors which are warm and colors which are cool. So warm colors are the pinks, blacks, maroons, etc. And the cooler colors are the blues, greens, yellows, etc. So if you look at this graph and you compare with this, these are the 2 sphincters. This is the horizontal sphincter here at the top. This is the upper sphincter. And again, you see a high pressure zone at the bottom. This is the lower sphincter. So all sphincters are, contracted even at rest. So you'll always see high pressure zone wherever there's a sphincter. And this is the peristaltic wave that you see sequentially starting from the top and going to the bottom like this. So basically it's a high pressure peristaltic wave which is going from the top to the bottom, and once it reaches to the bottom, the lower esophageal sphincter again relaxes. So you see the color changing from a warmer color to a cooler color, right? This is what basically a manometry tells us, right? Now to understand manometry, it's very simple. So you only need to understand 3 metrics, only 3 metrics. One is the integrated relaxation pressure. So what is integrated relaxation pressure? It basically tells us the adequacy of the relaxation of the lower esophageal sphincter. So you start 10 seconds from the swallow. Why do you start 10 seconds? Because it takes 10 seconds for the esophageal peristaltic wave to go from top to bottom. You start 10 seconds from the swallow, and in these 10 seconds, you find those 4 seconds where the pressure is the least, right? It could be contiguous, it could be discontiguous. Like in this case, the machine itself has marked those areas for us where the pressure is the least. So these are the 4 seconds where the pressure is the least. That is the integrated relaxation pressure. Now, when we talk of integrated relaxation pressure, we all have this notion that an IRP of more than 15 is abnormal, but that is not so. IRP cutoffs are different for different manufacturers, and they also vary with the patient's posture. Now the Chicago 4 tells us that you just don't do manometry in the supine position, but you can also do that in the sitting position. So your IRPs change according to the patient's posture, and we need to know that, and don't stick to this cutoff of 15. You can have cutoffs which are more or less than 15 and still be abnormal, right? Then comes this important metric called as distal latency. So what does distal latency actually mean? So distal latency is the distance between the initiation of swallow, this is the vertical line where the swallow is initiated, to the point called as the contractile deceleration point. So contractile deceleration point means there is a point in the esophageal peristalsis where the peristalsis actually slows down. So if you see here, this is the peristaltic wave, which is more or less vertical like this, and here it's become horizontal. So here the speed of the peristalsis has slowed down. So in essence, what distal latency tells us that the peristalsis has to propagate in a certain coordinated fashion. So it has to reach the lower part of the esophagus in a certain duration. If it is too fast, so if it is too fast, what would happen? The peristalsis would drop down like this. It would be more vertical. So the distal latency will reduce. So if you have a peristalsis which is too fast, it is counterproductive. It does not lead to propagation of the bolus. So you need to have a certain amount of latency for the propagation of the wave to go down, so that there is propagation of the bolus and there is no dysphagia, right? So for determination of the distal latency, you have to place your contractile deceleration point well. So this is one of the manual things that we all have to do when we are doing a manometry, placing the contractile deceleration point. Many times if you have been doing manometry, you'll realize that you have a step ladder kind of a peristalsis, and in these cases it becomes confusing where do you place the CDP, because where you place the CDP will determine how much is your distal latency. But then there are very clear instructions that your CDP should be on the 30 millimeter isobaric contour, and it should be within 3 centimeters of the lower esophageal sphincter. It should not be too high up, right? So whenever you have a condition where your graph tells you that your CDP is less than 4.5, mind you that this is a very, very rare phenomenon. It's not very usual to have this. If you see that the CDP is coming lesser, go back, recheck whether you have placed it correctly or not. If you have not, then again place it right and your CDP will become normal. The third important metric is the distal contractile integral. So distal contractile integral is basically telling us how vigorously is the peristalsis happening. So it's basically a multiplication of the amplitude of the peristalsis, the time of the peristalsis, and how strongly it is contracting. So basically, again, so for the bolus to propagate, you need a certain strength with which the esophagus is contracting. If it is too feeble, that means your DCI is very less. If say it is less than 100, that means the strength is not enough for the bolus to propagate forward. On the other hand, if it is too vigorous, if it is contracting very, very vigorously, it again leads to dysphagia, because the bolus will get trapped within the esophageal lumen, and that also is counterproductive. So DCI basically tells us how vigorously the esophagus is contracting. So these only 3 metrics you need to know very well to analyze a manometry graph. We all know these conventional, the common motility disorders, and I don't think I have to go into a lot of details of this. This is type 1 achalasia where the IRP is increased. There is no peristalsis. In type 2 achalasia, there is a pan-esophageal pressurization. In type 3 achalasia cardia, the IRP is high. That means the LES is not relaxing, but the contraction is premature. You have spastic motility disorders like hypercontractile esophagus, where you see it's contracting very, very vigorously. You see a dense color over there. This is high DCI. Or you have a premature contraction, as we discussed, which is distal spasm. You can also have hypotensive motility disorders, like where the contraction is very feeble, like ineffective esophageal motility or absent contractility. Now, the Chicago 4 tells us that you just don't do the manometry in the supine position, but you also use other additional maneuvers which are really useful. I'll show you examples for that. You use something called as a multiple rapid swallow. The multiple rapid swallow is when you give 2 ml, 2 ml, 2 ml, 2 ml, 5 such swallows in a rapid succession. This is done in a supine position, or in an erect posture. You ask the patient to take a drink of around 200 ml of liquid, and this is useful in certain situations. You can have a condition like this. Now, this is a patient presenting with dysphagia, right? Here you see absolutely no peristalsis and a very feeble IRP over here. Now, it could be type 1 achalasia cardia also, because mind you, in type 1 achalasia cardia, you have a variant where the IRP is low. It might not always be more than 15. So this could be an absent esophageal contractility. This could be a type 1 achalasia cardia. So the management of both is absolutely different. Whether will you subject this patient to a procedure like POEM? How do you differentiate between that? So here, if you do a rapid drink challenge to this patient, you do a rapid drink challenge, you will suddenly see that the IRP starts increasing. So this is a patient with type 1 achalasia cardia and not absent esophageal contractility. So one such classical place where this maneuvers help. You can use a time barium swallow. So if there's a holdup of barium, again goes in favor of a type 1 achalasia cardia and not a absent esophageal contractility. You have situations like this where the patient has achalasia cardia. In the beginning, there is no peristalsis at all. But as soon you start giving patient more and more water, with time you start seeing a pan-esophageal pressurization wave. So whether this is type 1 achalasia cardia or this is type 2 achalasia cardia. So does that matter? So this only tells us that there is some peristaltic reserve that is left in the esophageal body. So there is virtually no difference arbitrarily in how will you approach to treat this patient. In both these cases, maybe POEM is equivalent to a laparoscopic Hellers and better than a balloon. But here, does it matter to differentiate between a type 2 and a type 3 achalasia cardia? Here you see a graph which is not pan-esophageal pressurization like this. It is somewhat appears premature or somewhat appears like a type 2. We are not very certain what it is, but it does make a difference. How do you, whether it is type 2 or type 3? Because here your length of myotomy has to be, correct. So if it's a type 3, it makes a difference. So here I think using a barium add-on really helps you, and it tells us about the spastic segment that is actually there. So if it's a type 3 with a long spastic segment, you will go in for a longer myotomy. EGJ outflow obstruction is one of the most common, diagnosis that the machine gives us. Whenever you have an EGJ outflow obstruction, be very careful because this could be spurious. The Chicago 4 tells us that always, whenever you have a EGJ outflow obstruction, use a secondary position. When you use a secondary position, your graphs tend to change because most of these EGJ outflow obstructions are because of extrinsic compressions and the patient's posture. When you change the patient's posture, the IRP becomes normalized, and this was not a patient with a true EGJ outflow obstruction. So you have this conclusive criteria for EGJ outflow obstruction, which requires all three, that you do the manometry in both primary as well as in secondary positions. You should have clinically relevant symptoms, and you should have at least one supportive investigation like a timed barium esophagogram or an EndoFLIP. Hypercontractile patterns, remember that you can have a unique hypercontractile pattern where the hypercontraction is just there at the lower esophageal sphincter. So you can have patients presenting with chest pain, dysphagia, and the hypercontractile segment is just over there. We are all searching for a typical jackhammer's esophagus, which might not always be there. You can have a hypercontractile segment localizing just at the lower esophageal sphincter. Will you rush for a POEM for such patients? Will you rush for an for such patients? Never. Always try to go in for conservative management first before you rush for that. This was an interesting paper that I came across. Jackhammer's esophagus, almost 90 patients. Eosinophilic esophagitis was seen in 21% of all such patients. So always search for any alternative causes for spastic motility disorders before you rush for a interventional procedure. Now, hiatus hernia is one area where on the endoscopy, usually you might not be very certain because that depends on how much you insufflate. And this is one of the places where we very infrequently use a manometry. I think it's very, very useful to accurately characterize the hiatus. And not just that, the sensitivity and specificity of a high resolution manometry has been proven to be much better than using an endoscopy alone when you have to accurately classify a hiatus. Apart from that, it will also tell you about the esophageal motility, how good or bad it is, because that is really important. Because ineffective esophageal motility is seen in a lot of patients with GERD, and this is very, very important because previously it was thought that you can't do a 360-degree fundoplication in patients who have ineffective motility with GERD. But now there is something called as a multiple rapid swallow. You do a multiple rapid swallow and you see what is happening to the DCI after the multiple rapid swallow. If the DCI increases after a multiple rapid swallow, that means there is a peristaltic reserve. And this is the most important predictor to define whether you can do a 360-degree fundoplication or not. So ladies and gentlemen, I think that reading GI manometry is an art. Applying it is science. And mastering both is what transforms motility testing into meaningful clinical decisions. Thank you so much.
Excellent, Dr. Shrihari. Any questions from the house?
Esophageal aperistalsis, or another hand there is a DES, but IRP is normal. So how frequently we should do the repeat testing, 3 months, 6 months, and how we should follow these patients? Because these will be evolving achalasia patients.
Absolutely. So that was the graph I showed you.
Yeah.
The confusion usually is whether it is esophageal aperistalsis or it's a type 1 achalasia cardia. If the patient has classical dysphagia, you might be dealing with a type 1 achalasia cardia. I would strongly recommend that you do with this provocative maneuver. Maybe after 6 months, you repeat this. Yes.
Shrihari, very nice talk. But sometimes we see graph looking like a type 2, but reported as a type 3.
Yeah.
Yes. What is your suggestion?
So again, I showed you that. So I think in such cases where there's a borderline thing, you can add on the use of a barium to that, because you'll have to see for the spastic segment in such cases, and you have to be very certain that you're dealing with the right spastic segment. Do a barium. I would do a barium in all such cases to find out.
So here is sometimes we do the manometry and everything, patient has dysphagia, but that manometry finding does not fit into any of the known Chicago classification, out of syllabus. So what to do then?
So Chicago is still not all inclusive. You have certain motility disorders which still don't fit into Chicago. I think in such cases the impedance will really come into play. Maybe the future iterations of Chicago will include impedance. So impedance, what it tells us about the flow of bolus. What manometry is telling us just about the esophageal contraction. So the flow of bolus and the esophageal contraction might not always match with each other. So you might have situations where the contraction appears okay, but there is no flow of bolus. Like this classical ineffective esophageal motility, we don't know what to do with that. But if an ineffective esophageal motility is actually showing that the bolus transit is not happening, there is dysphagia. So I think an impedance will add on to that. A solid state manometry with impedance will help you in such cases.
But sir asks, in such cases, do flip and manometry match always in terms of
Sir,
leading concluding a
the
diagnosis?
concordance between a flip and manometry still is at the tune of 75 to 80%. It's still not 100%. I think we'll have to individualize our cases. I think more than a flip, an impedance will really be useful in such cases.
And Viresh, one of the important things is like for achalasia,
Yes,
like
sir.
if medical care workers, they develop symptoms of dysphagia, they are early seekers of medical attention, right?
Yes.
They'll get their barium early, they will get their manometry early. It's just like all plants become trees. So most of the other patients who come to us, they've got average duration of symptom 1 to 2 years. On the contrary, we seek it
Yes.
early. So we may not get classical signs
Yes.
on the manometry. So it's better is to repeat after 3 to 6 months.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.